In the fading glow of a Neapolitan sunset, an aging man stood at the balcony of his modest apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples. His silhouette was unmistakable even in old age, broad shoulders, a rigid jaw, and an aura that still whispered command. Charles Lucky Luciano, once the most powerful mob boss in America, now lived in exile, a king without a kingdom but a strategist whose mind refused to rest. Time had taken his homeland, his freedom, and most of his allies, yet something deeper remained untouched: his instinct for the game. And it was here, in the twilight of his life, that he began crafting one final gambit, one that would ripple through criminal empires long after his death. To understand this last move, you must first understand the man. Luciano was never just another gangster. He was a visionary who saw patterns where others saw chaos, opportunities where others saw danger. His power didn't come from brute force alone. It came from his ability to understand people, their fears, their ambitions, their weaknesses. He treated crime the way a chess master approaches a grand board, always thinking several moves ahead. Even now, decades after his rise and fall, historians and criminologists still struggle to fully define him. Was he a mastermind or a monster? A businessman or a tyrant? A product of his time or the architect of a new one? As the waves crashed gently against the shoreline beneath him, Luciano's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. His body was aging, but his thoughts were sharp, calculating. He had lived a life defined by strategy, survival, and reinvention. And now, with the world believing his empire had crumbled, he was quietly setting in motion a decision that would reshape international crime. He knew that power didn't disappear. It transformed, moved, it adapted. And he intended to shape its evolution one final time. His story was not just about violence or control, it was about transformation. When Luciano entered the American underworld, it was a world ruled by old-world traditions and hot-headed feuds. Families fought over scraps, bosses relied on superstition, and the Mafia lacked the structure required to thrive in a modern industrial nation. Luciano recognized this flaw long before others did. He saw that the future belonged to those who could organize, not those who struck the hardest. His rise to dominance was built on this insight, an idea that crime could be systematized, streamlined, and operated like a corporation. It was radical. It was effective. And it made him the most influential mobster of his generation. But with innovation came enemies. Politicians wanted to make an example out of him. Rivals wanted to destroy him. And the public saw in him the embodiment of organized criminal power. His fall was inevitable not because he failed, but because his success was too visible, too disruptive, too threatening to the balance of American law. When he was finally arrested and exiled, many believed that was the end of Lucky Luciano, that the story had closed. But they misunderstood him. Luciano was never defined by geography or circumstance. His influence stretched across oceans, and his mind remained a weapon sharper than any knife or gun. Now, as he stood on that balcony in Italy, older, slower, yet still dangerous, he reflected on the moves that had shaped his life. Every betrayal, every alliance, every calculated risk. The ghosts of his past hovered in the quiet room behind him, the nodding figures of the commission, the smoky back rooms where deals were forged, the cold prison walls where he plotted silently, waiting for the right moment. He had survived too much to fade quietly into history. And even in exile, Luciano understood something most of his enemies didn't. Influence doesn't vanish, it simply relocates. This is the story of that relocation, of a last gambit born not from desperation but from vision. It is the story of a man who refused to let age or exile define his legacy. A man who continued to pull strings from afar, shaping the future of organized crime across continents. A man who, even stripped of his throne, managed to reshape the world one final time with a single, calculated decision. Before the world would know it, before investigators could trace the threads, before mob families could grasp the shift, before the press could even name it, Luciano had already won. His last move was not explosive. It was quiet, strategic, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But for those who lived in the underworld, its impact was seismic. This documentary unravels that final chapter, how a man banished from the empire he built still managed to rewrite the rules of the Mafia from the shadows. This is the beginning of Lucky Luciano's last gambit. A move made not with guns, not with armies, but with a mind sharpened by decades of power, betrayal, and survival. And like every great strategist, Luciano saved his most daring play for the end. Before Lucky Luciano could execute the final gambit that would redefine the Mafia, the criminal world he inherited was a chaotic, unstable battleground. The American underworld in the early 20th century was a realm driven not by strategy or structure but by unrestrained ego, blood feuds, and archaic traditions. To understand the brilliance of Luciano's last move, one must first understand the disorder he had spent his life trying to fix. It was a world carried into America by immigrants who brought with them memories of Sicilian vendettas and strict codes of honor, a world where violence settled even the smallest disputes and ambition was often rewarded with a bullet. Long before his rise, the Mafia in the United States was fragmented into scattered factions: Neapolitans, Sicilians, Calabrians, and other groups, each clinging to their own customs, loyalties, and leaders. These clans operated like isolated fiefdoms, mistrusting one another as much as they mistrusted the law. Alliances were temporary, fragile, and often forged through marriage, coercion, or fear. Betrayal was not an exception, it was an expectation. The idea of a unified, nationwide criminal network was unimaginable. Every family wanted supremacy, and every boss believed himself the rightful ruler of the streets. The result was a landscape soaked in paranoia and blood. Prohibition, the era that transformed small-time crooks into powerful figures, intensified this chaos. When alcohol became illegal in 1920, an entire underground economy exploded overnight. Bootlegging offered fortunes that went beyond anything the old Mafia families had ever controlled. But with opportunity came war. Gangs killed each other for control of speakeasies, smuggling routes, docks, and political connections. New York alone became a battlefield divided among dozens of volatile operations. Violence became a language. Street corners became borders. The police, often corrupt or overwhelmed, couldn't contain the spiral, and reformers lacked the resources to dismantle the burgeoning empire of organized crime. The old bosses, men like Salvatore D'Aquila, Joe Masuria, and later Joe the Boss Masuria, attempted to rule through fear. They believed brutality was leadership and that tradition alone was enough to govern. But their methods couldn't keep pace with America's rapidly evolving criminal marketplace. While they clung to Sicilian customs, younger gangsters saw a different future, one shaped by profit rather than pride. The old guard valued ritual. The new generation valued money. This clash created deep fractures, setting the stage for inevitable conflict. It was in this fractured world that alliances formed and dissolved like shifting sand. The Morello faction fought against rivals for control of Manhattan. Brooklyn gangs battled for brownstone territories. The Camorra and the Mafia competed for dominance in the early 1900s, leaving a trail of bodies as they struggled for influence. Distrust was woven into every deal, every handshake, every whispered conversation in dimly lit bars. Even within families, power struggles erupted between cousins, uncles, and brothers, each vying for a larger slice of the criminal pie. No one was safe and no one was indispensable. As prohibition matured, the violence escalated. Bootleggers hijacked each other's shipments, assassins gunned down rivals in broad daylight, and corruption infiltrated city halls, police stations, and courtrooms. Every decision carried mortal risk. Each murder sparked retaliation. Each retaliation triggered a cycle of vendetta. The public became both fascinated and horrified, newspapers filled with headlines about gang wars that seemed like something out of a foreign world. But to men like Luciano, sharp, observant, calculating, this wasn't chaos for its own sake, it was an opportunity. Even in his youth, Luciano recognized something profound that the older generation refused to see: a divided underworld was a vulnerable one. A mafia defined by infighting couldn't survive the pressures of modern America. While the old dons competed for scraps, the true wealth was slipping away into the hands of those who understood the value of unity, efficiency, and strategic partnerships. Luciano understood that prohibition demanded organization, networks, and systems, not scattered clans acting on impulse. He saw that the underworld needed structure as much as any legitimate corporation did. And he knew he was capable of building it. But before he could rise, he had to navigate the treacherous landscape around him. Every street corner had its own ruler. Every neighborhood had its own enforcer. The mafia was not a single entity, it was dozens of independent, often hostile tribes. Luciano watched as promising gangsters were killed over misunderstandings, as potential alliances crumbled over insults, as wealth evaporated in the fires of unnecessary war. He saw how much power was being wasted because no one could see beyond personal pride. The old dons believed the past was the key to the future. Luciano believed the future demanded change. By the time he reached adulthood, the streets had taught him everything he needed to know about the dangers of fragmented power. He witnessed firsthand the assassinations that reshaped the hierarchy, the betrayals that turned friends into enemies overnight, and the brutal lessons carved into the asphalt of New York City. Yet he also recognized something else, an opening. The chaos that terrified others inspired him. Disorder, he knew, could be molded into order. Conflict could be redirected into cooperation. And violence, if used strategically, could become a tool of stability rather than fear. Before Luciano's last gambit could ever be conceived, the world he stepped into had to crumble. The fragmented, tradition-bound mafia of the old world was not built for the modern era. Its leaders were too stubborn, too arrogant, too blind to the possibilities ahead. That blindness created the space for a new kind of leader. One who could unify the clans, streamline operations, and turn crime into an empire. The underworld before Luciano wasn't just chaotic, it was a system begging to be rewritten. And Luciano, with his sharp mind and relentless ambition, was destined to be the one who rewrote it. Long before Lucky Luciano became a titan of organized crime, he was simply Salvatore Lucania, an immigrant boy navigating the brutal streets of New York's Lower East Side. What the world would one day call strategy, vision, and criminal genius began as survival instincts forged in poverty, discrimination, and constant danger. The neighborhood was a melting pot of cultures but also a battlefield of desperation. Crime wasn't a choice for many immigrants, it was an inevitability. And for young Salvatore, who arrived in America at just 9 years old, the harsh streets quickly became both a classroom and an arena. The Lower East Side in the early 1900s was a place where hunger and ambition collided. Children hustled to help feed their families. Gangs roamed the tenement blocks, offering protection or threats depending on the hour. It was here that Salvatore learned the first rules of power: protect yourself, choose allies wisely, and never appear weak. The rough conditions hardened him, but more importantly, they taught him to observe. Even as a child, he watched how the strong imposed their will, how the weak were exploited, and how every conflict, whether physical or political, had a winner and a loser. These observations shaped his emerging worldview, one in which survival depended on understanding human nature. School quickly became secondary to the real education happening on the streets. Salvatore gravitated toward the local gangs, drawn not just by excitement but by the unspoken system of respect that governed their hierarchies. He realized early on that brute strength alone never decided who led. It was usually the kid who could talk, who could negotiate, who could convince others to follow him. Luciano's charisma began forming in these early street encounters. He learned how to read faces, anticipate reactions, and defuse or escalate tension depending on what served him best. Even as a teenager, he carried himself with a confidence that unsettled those around him, a quiet authority uncommon for someone his age. Around this time, he met other young immigrants who would later become key figures in his life, among them Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Their early friendship began not with crime but with mutual recognition. Lansky, a Jewish boy with a sharp mind and calm demeanor, shared Luciano's understanding of power beyond violence. Siegel, volatile and fearless, possessed the raw aggression that made him both an asset and a weapon. Together they formed a trio that blended intellect, strategy, and firepower. It was an unusual alliance in an era when Italians, Jews, and Irish rarely mixed socially, let alone in criminal ventures. Luciano didn't just tolerate this diversity, he embraced it. He saw potential in unity before the idea ever crossed the minds of older gangsters. As Salvatore grew into his teenage years, he began to refine his idea of how real power worked. He noticed how older mobsters clung to rigid traditions brought from the old country. They demanded respect based on heritage, enforced rules that no longer fit the environment, and wasted energy on petty disputes that weakened them. Even from a young age, Luciano felt disconnected from these customs. To him, respect didn't come from bloodlines or rituals, it came from results. He believed authority should be earned, not inherited, and this belief quietly separated him from the old world mentality dominating early mafia groups. His first major steps into crime came through small jobs, running errands for gang leaders, delivering packages, collecting debts. But even these minor tasks revealed his talent. He never panicked, never questioned, and never bragged. Leaders noticed. He was reliable, smart, and bold enough to take risks without being reckless. Word spread through the neighborhoods. Young Salvatore Lucania was someone worth watching. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he was the one who always seemed to anticipate what came next. By his mid-teens, he upgraded from petty jobs to more profitable schemes: extortion, gambling, and eventually working with the 5 Points Gang, one of the most feared criminal organizations in the city. Under the mentorship of Johnny Torrio, a master strategist in his own right, Luciano received his first exposure to structured crime. Torrio valued organization and saw potential in Salvatore's burgeoning leadership style. Luciano studied Torrio's methods closely, absorbing lessons about finances, alliances, and the importance of keeping violence controlled rather than chaotic. But perhaps the most important lesson came not from Torrio or Lansky but from a single life-changing betrayal. As a young man, Luciano was kidnapped, beaten, and stabbed by unknown assailants. He survived, barely, but the incident left him with a permanent droop in one eye. The streets whispered that he had been attacked by rivals jealous of his rising status. Others believed he refused to pay protection money. Whatever the reason, the attack hardened him. It taught him not that the world was dangerous, he already knew that, but that betrayal often came from unexpected places. From then on, he trusted carefully, measured every alliance, and kept emotional distance from those he worked with. The nickname Lucky emerged from this survival, but the truth was deeper. Luciano wasn't lucky, he was resilient, cautious, and incredibly adaptable. He learned to hide fear behind a calm expression, to treat setbacks as lessons, and to strike only when the timing favored him. The stabbing didn't weaken him, it reforged him. And the newly hardened Salvatore Lucania began thinking like a general. During this period, he started developing a personal blueprint for power. He believed the future of crime was cooperation, not division. He believed violence should be used sparingly but effectively. He believed money, not heritage, determined influence. These ideas were revolutionary within the Mafia world, which still clung to old Sicilian customs. Luciano's vision was quietly forming. A network of gangs working together like departments in a corporation, each profiting, each accountable. It was the seed of what would later become the National Mafia Commission. By the time he reached adulthood, the boy from Sicily had transformed into a calculating young leader with a clear sense of purpose. The streets had taught him survival, betrayal had taught him caution, and alliances had taught him strategy. Luciano's early life wasn't just a background story, it was the foundation of everything he would build. His blueprint for power wasn't accidental. It was born from observation, pain, ambition, and an almost instinctive understanding of human behavior. Long before the world feared his name, Lucky Luciano was already designing the future he intended to rule. By the time Salvatore Lucania fully embraced the name Lucky Luciano, he was no longer just a street kid with ambition. He was a man moving with intent, precision, and a growing reputation that demanded respect. His transformation from a young hustler into a criminal architect didn't happen overnight. It evolved through a series of strategic choices, carefully cultivated relationships, and an instinctive ability to navigate the shifting power currents of New York's underworld. Every risk he took seemed calculated, every alliance deliberate. Luciano wasn't simply participating in the game, he was learning how to control the board. His early years with the 5 Points gang gave him both muscle and credibility. Under Johnny Torrio's watchful guidance, Luciano absorbed the fundamentals of large-scale criminal operations, how to run gambling rackets, manage brothels, and exploit political corruption. Torrio's philosophy was simple. Violence should be a last resort, not the opening move. Luciano took this principle further, shaping it into a personal doctrine. He began to see crime not as a brawl for territory but as a business demanding structure, diplomacy, and long-term strategy. Where others saw rivals, he saw potential partners or future assets. Where others reacted impulsively, he paused, studied, and predicted outcomes as if anticipating the next 3 moves in a chess match. His ascent accelerated when he entered the inner circle of Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, one of New York's most powerful mafia figures. Masuria embodied the old-world mentality, superstitious, egotistical, and obsessed with maintaining power through fear. Luciano joined him not because he admired the man but because he understood the strategic value of proximity. Working under Masuria gave him access to resources, networks, and influence. It also revealed the deep flaws in Masuria's leadership. The boss was paranoid and inflexible, clinging to Sicilian traditions that had no place in the evolving American criminal landscape. Luciano, who believed in modernization, watched in silence as Masuria's decisions dragged the organization into unnecessary conflicts. Though outwardly loyal, Luciano began quietly reshaping his own circle. His alliances with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel strengthened. He forged relationships with Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and other ambitious young gangsters who shared his forward-thinking mindset. These men didn't care about old country feuds or rigid codes of tradition. They wanted money, influence, and efficiency. Luciano's magnetism, intelligence, and ability to manage conflicting personalities made him the natural center of this growing faction. People gravitated to him because he offered something rare: stability in a world defined by violence. His operations expanded rapidly during Prohibition. Bootlegging was more than a criminal enterprise, it was an economic revolution, and Luciano understood that scale was everything. He negotiated deals with Irish and Jewish gangs, securing distribution routes that bypassed traditional mafia hierarchies. He invested in speakeasies, employed expert distillers, bribed police officers, and built transportation networks that operated across state lines. Every successful deal reinforced his belief that the future of crime depended on cooperation among ethnic groups, not segregation. This vision was radical in its time. It unsettled the old dons, who viewed interethnic alliances as a dilution of their cultural authority. Yet it was this openness to collaboration that elevated Luciano beyond the role of a mere enforcer. He became a negotiator, a diplomat of the underworld. His ability to remain calm in high-pressure situations made him indispensable. When tensions erupted between different gangs, Luciano was often the one called to mediate. He had a talent for framing decisions in a way that appealed to greed rather than pride, turning potential conflicts into profitable partnerships. The more he resolved, the more his reputation grew. Crime bosses across the city began seeking his advice. In a world ruled by ego, Luciano offered logic. In a world driven by violence, he offered profit. But ambition carries risk, and Luciano's rise placed him in the crosshairs of powerful rivals. One of them was Salvatore Maranzano, a sophisticated and calculating Sicilian who arrived in New York with dreams of establishing himself as a supreme mafia ruler. Maranzano, like Masuria, represented the old guard, but unlike Masuria, he possessed a sharp strategic mind. When the Castellamarese War erupted between Masuria and Maranzano, Luciano found himself trapped between two worlds: loyalty to his boss and loyalty to his own vision of the future. This internal tension marked a critical turning point in Luciano's evolution. Masuria demanded absolute obedience and traditional allegiance. Maranzano offered a promise of order but at the cost of Sicilian dominance over all other groups. Luciano wanted neither. He wanted a system where money dictated power, not heritage. A system where conflict was managed, not escalated. A system that blended the ruthlessness of the streets with the structure of legitimate enterprises. Neither Masuria nor Maranzano could deliver that future. So Luciano decided he would. His decision to betray Masuria was not impulsive. It was the culmination of months of observation, political maneuvering, and strategic calculation. Luciano understood that choosing sides in a war controlled by ancient grudges would only lead to ruin. To survive, he needed to end the war entirely. And to end it, he needed to eliminate the old guard. With surgical precision, he orchestrated Masuria's assassination. It was a bold and dangerous move, one that cemented his reputation as a man willing to shape the future through decisive action. Yet victory was only temporary. After Masuria's death, Maranzano attempted to seize full control, naming himself boss of all bosses, and ordering the reorganization of New York's mafia into structured families. For a moment, it appeared Maranzano would become the new tyrant. But Luciano saw through the illusion. Maranzano, though more refined, was still driven by old-world thinking. He wanted singular rule, not collective power. He saw Luciano's alliances with Jewish gangsters as a threat. He viewed modern ideas as dangerous impurities. And soon he began plotting Luciano's murder. But Luciano, always thinking ahead, discovered the plot and responded with a swift and final counterstrike. Maranzano was assassinated in his office, ending the last major obstacle to Luciano's vision. With both old-world bosses gone, the path was clear. Luciano ascended from street soldier to mastermind, reshaping the mafia into a national organization governed by structure, shared power, and profit-driven principles. This transformation was not just about survival, it was a testament to his ability to evolve. Luciano had risen by understanding people better than they understood themselves. He had mastered the art of reading intentions, managing ambitions, and predicting outcomes. His journey from the Lower East Side to the pinnacle of organized crime was built not on brute force but on strategy, patience, and an unwavering belief in modernization. And now, with control firmly in his hands, Luciano was ready to build an empire unlike anything the criminal world had seen before. His evolution was complete, but his greatest work was still ahead. When the dust settled after the deaths of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, a rare silence fell over New York's underworld. It was the calm after decades of chaos, betrayal, and relentless bloodshed. For the first time in years, the future felt unwritten, open, malleable, waiting for someone with vision to shape it. Lucky Luciano stepped into that silence not as a tyrant seeking personal glory, but as an architect ready to build a new order. He understood better than anyone that the Mafia could no longer function as a collection of isolated tribes driven by ancient grudges. America was evolving, and crime had to evolve with it. This was his moment to create a system that could prevent the old cycle wars from returning, a system that would carry the Mafia into a new era. Luciano's boldest and most revolutionary idea was simple yet radical: eliminate the position of boss of all bosses forever. He had seen how absolute power corrupted Masuria and Maranzano, how it bred paranoia, encouraged dictatorship, and turned the Mafia inward with self-destruction. To Luciano, this outdated hierarchy was the deadliest threat to organized crime. He envisioned something different, something collective. He wanted to transform the Mafia from a kingdom ruled by one man into a federation governed by many, where decisions were based on strategy rather than ego. The foundation of this vision was the creation of a national governing body. Luciano called it the Commission. It would be composed of the most powerful Mafia families, each represented by their respective bosses. Instead of operating in secrecy from one another, they would meet, discuss disputes, vote on major decisions, and ensure that violence remained controlled and justified. The commission would function like a corporate board of directors, giving every major family a seat at the table. No single boss would have unchecked authority. Luciano believed that stability meant prosperity, and prosperity meant power. To build this new structure, he first reorganized New York's criminal landscape. He divided the city into 5 distinct families: the Luciano, Mangano, Bonanno, Prophesai, and Gagliano families. Each family had its own territory, its own rackets, and its own leadership. This division created balance, reducing the likelihood of territorial disputes. Luciano placed trusted men, those who shared his modern philosophy, into key leadership positions. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and others filled crucial roles, ensuring that his influence remained embedded across multiple layers of the new system. Outside New York, Luciano extended invitations to powerful mobsters from other cities. Chicago's Al Capone organization, represented by Frank Nitti and the remnants of Torrio's legacy, gained an influential seat. Crime families from Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia were also included. Even factions from New Jersey and parts of New England became part of this growing network. The commission wasn't just a New York body, it was a national alliance. For the first time in American history, organized crime had a unified leadership structure stretching across states. But Luciano didn't limit participation to Italian mafia families alone. He understood that to maintain long-term stability, the commission needed respect from all criminal groups. This led him to form strategic relationships with Jewish and Irish crime organizations. Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, before his fall, and other influential figures were granted unofficial but significant access to the commission's decisions. Luciano believed that excluding powerful non-Italian gangs would only create new conflicts. Cooperation, not segregation, would ensure a more profitable future for everyone. The first true test of the commission's authority came when Dutch Schultz proposed assassinating prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. Schultz, a volatile and unpredictable figure, believed Dewey's investigations were an existential threat. But the commission understood the consequences of such a reckless move. Killing Dewey would bring national enforcement down on all of them. Luciano, along with Meyer Lansky and other commission members, voted no. Schultz, defiant, threatened to go through with the assassination on his own. This violation of collective decision-making forced the commission to act. Schultz was eliminated to preserve unity. This incident marked a turning point. It proved that the commission wasn't symbolic, it had teeth. It would enforce decisions even if that meant killing powerful gangsters. Violence was no longer chaotic. It was strategic and approved only when necessary for the survival of the organization. Under Luciano's guidance, the Mafia transformed into a highly organized network with rules, procedures, and profit-driven motives. Disputes that once ended in street wars were now settled through votes. Family affiliation still mattered, but ambition was now balanced by diplomacy. Luciano's system reduced internal bloodshed drastically, allowing families to focus on expanding their operations instead of destroying each other. His reforms extended beyond organizational structure. Luciano modernized financial operations, encouraging investment in legitimate businesses to launder money. He promoted partnerships with unions, recognizing that control over labor meant control over industries. He expanded gambling operations, streamlined narcotics trafficking routes, and used the commission to divide territories fairly. Crime was no longer bound by tradition. It was streamlined, efficient, and in many ways corporate. Yet, despite all this power, Luciano resisted the temptation to crown himself as an absolute ruler. This restraint distinguished him from past bosses. He understood that fear-based leadership created enemies, while shared power created allies. The commission wasn't just about balancing influence, it was about enforcing a philosophy that prioritized longevity over pride. Luciano's focus was always on the bigger picture, a sustainable criminal empire capable of expanding without collapsing from within. The creation of the commission marked the pinnacle of Luciano's rise from a street soldier to a mastermind of modern organized crime. It showcased not only his strategic brilliance but his deep understanding of human behavior, group psychology, and political structure. He wasn't simply reacting to the world around him, he was redesigning it. What Luciano constructed wasn't just a criminal organization, it was an institution, a legacy, a system that would outlive him and influence the global underworld for decades. The commission was his masterpiece, a reflection of his belief that power works best when it is distributed, structured, and aligned with shared goals. But even as he solidified his reign, forces outside the underworld, government pressure, ambitious prosecutors, and shifting public sentiment were beginning to take notice. Luciano's brilliance had reshaped the Mafia, but it had also made him a target. And in time, his greatest organizational triumph would also become the foundation upon which his enemies built their case against him. Once the commission was established and the Mafia's internal chaos subdued, Luciano turned his attention to something even more ambitious, transforming scattered criminal activities into a cohesive, revenue-generating industry. For him, crime was not a series of isolated hustles but an interconnected enterprise, one that required management, planning, and infrastructure. While former bosses were content with extorting local shops or controlling a handful of gambling joints, Luciano envisioned a national network of vice that operated with the precision of a corporation and the earnings of a monopoly. At the center of this vision was the recognition that prohibition had changed the criminal landscape forever. Bootlegging had created a demand so massive, so constant, that it resembled an official industry. Illegal alcohol was being manufactured, transported, stored, and distributed with logistical complexity rivaling major legitimate companies. Luciano saw that if crime could be organized efficiently in one sector, it could be organized in others as well. Alcohol was the beginning, but not the end. Luciano's first major project was restructuring the prostitution business, one of the most lucrative yet poorly managed criminal operations of the era. Instead of allowing independent madams or loosely affiliated pimps to control scattered brothels, he consolidated operations. He centralized finances, established territories, and implemented quality control to maintain a consistent customer base. Under his oversight, prostitution became a streamlined industry where the Mafia controlled everything: locations, workers, protection rackets, bribes, and profits. This transformation not only increased revenue but also tightened the Mafia's grip on city politics, as police and politicians who benefited financially became loyal partners rather than unpredictable threats. Yet prostitution was only one spoke in Luciano's expanding wheel. Gambling, long considered a staple of organized crime, received a modern upgrade. Luciano encouraged the creation of gambling parlors that operated discreetly and efficiently. Numbers rackets were automated through reliable bookkeepers and mathematicians, many recruited from marginalized communities with few economic opportunities. Betting syndicates were connected across boroughs, creating a unified network where risks and rewards could be balanced. The more organized gambling became, the safer it was from police crackdowns, and the more predictable the profits became. Then came narcotics, the most controversial and deeply debated sector within the Mafia. Many traditional bosses opposed drug trafficking, believing it brought too much attention and carried harsh penalties. Luciano disagreed. He saw heroin and cocaine not as a danger but as an inevitable market, one that would explode with or without Mafia involvement. If the Mafia abstained, someone else would step in. He believed that as long as operations were discreet, controlled, and supervised from a distance, the rewards far outweighed the risks. Under Luciano's guidance, the Mafia established international drug routes that stretched from Europe to America. These routes relied on connections in Cuba, Turkey, Sicily, and France, forming what would later be known as the French Connection. Narcotics were shipped discreetly in small quantities, smuggled through ports with the help of bribed officials, and distributed in ways that minimized exposure. Luciano's philosophy was clear: crime should operate like a supply chain. Every step, from production to distribution, had to be monitored, optimized, and protected. His operations also deeply penetrated the labor unions, particularly those in the docks, trucking industries, and garment factories. Luciano recognized that unions controlled movement of goods, movement of supplies, and movement of workers. If the Mafia controlled the unions, they controlled entire industries. They could demand kickbacks, force companies to comply, or threaten strikes that would cripple a business overnight. Through Frank Costello and other allies, Luciano strategically placed loyalists in key union positions, turning labor power into a form of political leverage. One of the most overlooked but transformative parts of Luciano's empire was his approach to corruption. Historically, bribery had been chaotic, handled by low-level thugs with inconsistent results. Luciano restructured this too. Bribery became an investment, calculated, budgeted, and executed with precision. Judges, police captains, district attorneys, and city council members were discreetly placed on Mafia payrolls. The goal was not to buy loyalty temporarily, but to build a long-term network of influence that protected operations from legal interference. Under Luciano, corruption became institutionalized, a parallel political system operating behind the curtain of democracy. Luciano's greatest strength was his ability to connect all these ventures. Prostitution fed into corruption, which protected narcotics routes. Gambling funded political favors, which secured union influence. The unions, in turn, guaranteed smooth transport for bootlegging shipments. Everything was linked, everything circulated money, and everything fed into a larger system. He had created a web where no single thread existed alone. Each reinforced the others. The result was an underworld that functioned more efficiently than many legitimate corporations. Central to this entire transformation was Meyer Lansky, Luciano's closest advisor and arguably the only man he trusted without reservation. Lansky's financial brilliance complemented Luciano's strategic leadership. Together, they analyzed risks, calculated profits, and identified emerging markets. Lansky helped design the bookkeeping systems that kept operations organized, and his deep connections in Cuba and the Caribbean proved vital in expanding into international gambling. Their partnership was built on mutual respect, shared ambition, and an understanding that modern crime required more than muscle, it required intellect. Despite the enormous profits, Luciano maintained strict discipline. He understood that with growth came scrutiny. Any branch of the criminal enterprise could become a liability if mismanaged. He insisted on loyalty, discretion, and efficiency. Those who broke the rules or threatened the larger system were removed quickly and quietly. Luciano's approach to discipline wasn't fueled by sadism but necessity. A single reckless mistake could bring law enforcement down on everyone. By the mid-1930s, Luciano had achieved what few thought possible. He turned organized crime into an organized industry. He wasn't just a mob boss, he was the CEO of a sprawling empire built on vice, strategy, and innovation. The Mafia families under the Commission weren't merely criminal gangs. They were divisions in a national corporation with shared interests and coordinated goals. Money flowed through their operations like oil in a machine, smooth and constant. But success has a way of attracting enemies, powerful, determined enemies. As Luciano expanded the Mafia's influence, politicians and law enforcement leaders began to focus their attention on the man they believed was behind it all. They saw him not as a businessman, but as a growing threat to public order, democracy, and economic stability. And as the web of vice grew stronger, so did the determination of those seeking to tear it apart. Luciano had built an empire, but unlike the gangs of old, he now faced adversaries who were just as organized, ambitious, and relentless as he was. The next chapter of his life would test every lesson he had learned, because the government was preparing a war that would challenge the very foundation of the empire he created. As Lucky Luciano's empire expanded and the Commission brought stability to the underworld, a new phase of his journey began, one defined not by building structures, but by navigating the complex and often treacherous web of allies and enemies that surrounded him. Power attracts loyalty, but it also breeds resentment. And in a world where every handshake could hide a knife, Luciano's greatest challenge became managing the fragile balance between friendship and betrayal. The core of Luciano's strength rested on a small group of trusted allies, men who not only believed in his vision but complemented his weaknesses with their strengths. Chief among them was Meyer Lansky, the quiet architect of financial strategy. Lansky was more than a partner. He was Luciano's mirror, the man who understood that crime was an evolving business requiring intelligence, discretion, and international thinking. Their alliance defied ethnic divisions and set a precedent in a time when Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs rarely cooperated. Lansky's level-headedness stabilized Luciano's more daring impulses, and together they formed a powerhouse of logic and ambition. Then there was Bugsy Siegel, fiery, fearless, and at times uncontrollable. Siegel's aggression gave Luciano muscle where subtlety was not enough. Many feared Siegel's volatility, but Luciano recognized a rare asset in him. A man capable of delivering violent solutions without hesitation when diplomacy failed. Siegel may have been unpredictable, but his loyalty to Luciano was unwavering. Their bond mirrored a brotherhood forged in the early days of street hustling, long before power complicated their lives. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, played yet another crucial role. Costello wielded influence in political circles, bridging the worlds of crime and governance with eloquence and charm. He didn't need guns or intimidation. He had conversations, deals, and a mind built for persuasion. Costello expanded Luciano's reach into city halls, unions, and state offices. In many ways he was the diplomat of the commission, ensuring that the Mafia's presence seeped into systems once thought impenetrable. But alliances, even strong ones, came with complications. Vito Genovese, cunning and ambitious, grew increasingly envious of Luciano's authority. Though he stood beside Luciano publicly, Genovese harbored dreams of taking his place. Unlike Lansky or Costello, Genovese cared less about modernizing crime and more about personal power. He was traditional, brutal, and obsessed with his own rise. Luciano understood this. He sensed the hunger in Genovese's eyes, but he also recognized the value of keeping a dangerous man close rather than letting him roam unchecked. Their alliance was one of necessity, not trust, and Luciano constantly watched for signs of betrayal. Beyond internal rivals, Luciano's enemies stretched across the criminal landscape. Some were subtle, others overt. Joe Adonis, a longtime associate, admired Luciano but occasionally tested his patience with reckless acts that drew unnecessary attention. Dutch Schultz, volatile and prone to tantrums, repeatedly defied commission decisions, pushing the entire underworld toward conflict. While Luciano sought diplomacy, Schultz embodied chaos. His impulsiveness became a liability that eventually forced Luciano's hand, proving that even allies could become enemies if they threatened the system. Meanwhile, in the larger national crime network, figures like Albert Anastasia hovered in the shadows, loyal in appearance but unpredictable beneath the surface. Anastasia, known as the Lord High Executioner for his role in Murder Incorporated, operated with a level of brutality that frightened even hardened criminals. While he respected Luciano, he respected power even more. Luciano knew that men like Anastasia could shift loyalties if the tides of influence changed. But perhaps the most dangerous enemies were those outside the underworld, men in suits rather than trench coats. Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, fueled by ambition and moral crusading, saw Luciano not as a criminal kingpin but as a stepping stone in his political career. Dewey had made a name for himself shutting down bootlegging operations, and Luciano represented the pinnacle of what he sought to conquer. Behind Dewey stood a growing force of reformers, journalists, and public figures who were tired of seeing crime flourish in their cities. Luciano's success had made him a symbol, a target too big to ignore. This combination of external pressure and internal plotting created a quiet storm. As Luciano expanded his influence, his enemies grew more desperate. Rival gang bosses whispered behind closed doors, fearing that Luciano's modern methods threatened their traditional ways of life. Some sought to undermine his authority by forming alliances with dissenters. Others plotted more direct methods, hoping to remove him as they had removed previous leaders. Despite these threats, Luciano maintained remarkable poise. He understood that leadership required balance. Too much force would alienate allies, too much leniency would empower enemies. He made himself accessible yet slightly distant, friendly yet intimidating. His charisma became armor, allowing him to diffuse tensions and command respect without drawing unnecessary suspicion. Even those who disliked him admitted he was fair, an essential trait in a world where fairness was scarce. Still, tensions simmered. The commission helped settle disputes, but personal rivalries never fully disappeared. Luciano found himself constantly mediating conflicts, between families, between factions, between egos too fragile to accept compromise. Sometimes his diplomacy succeeded. Other times violence followed. And with each passing year, the balance grew harder to maintain. One of the most significant challenges came from the old guards who survived the Castellamarese War. These men tolerated Luciano's leadership but never embraced his reforms. They resented his partnerships with non-Italian gangs and his dismissal of old-world hierarchies. To them, Luciano represented a betrayal of tradition. To Luciano, they represented obstacles holding back progress. This ideological divide created a cold war within the Mafia, one that would eventually erupt as political pressure increased. Complicating matters further was the growing involvement of international criminal groups. Luciano's connections in Cuba, Italy, and France helped expand narcotics networks, but they also brought new rivalries. Sicilian Mafia leaders recognized his influence and feared it. Some sought alliance, others quietly plotted to limit his reach. Luciano saw the shifting alliances overseas as both expansion and risk. He knew the Mafia was evolving beyond national borders, and if he didn't control that evolution, someone else would. Every friend Luciano gained came with a potential price. Every enemy he defeated left a void for new threats. The intricate balance of allies and enemies shaped his daily decisions, forcing him to navigate between loyalty and survival with surgical precision. He understood better than anyone that power was never permanent. It had to be managed, defended, and constantly recalibrated. He had built a network stronger than any in American history, but he also knew this network was delicate. The wrong alliance could break it. The wrong enemy could expose it. And the wrong moment of trust could destroy him. Luciano stood at the center of this complex web, a man whose brilliance forged unity but whose enemies waited patiently for the moment he stumbled. And as pressure from law enforcement intensified, cracks began to appear, cracks that would soon reshape the entire underworld and force Luciano to face the most dangerous battle of his life. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's criminal empire was running with the efficiency of a corporation and the secrecy of a clandestine army. But beneath the smooth surface of profits, partnerships, and organizational discipline, a silent war was forming, one Luciano could sense long before it exploded. It was a war waged not with bullets on street corners, but with investigations, political maneuvering, coded messages, and betrayals hidden behind courtroom doors. While his enemies in the underworld had tried and failed to bring him down, a far more determined force was now positioning itself to strike: the government. Law enforcement had been battling organized crime for decades, but the Mafia structure made it nearly impossible to dismantle. Police relied on confessions, witnesses, and documented evidence, none of which the Mafia provided. Members adhered to omerta, the ancient code of silence that forbade cooperation with authorities. To break omerta was to invite torture, exile, or a death sentence carried out with merciless precision. This made prosecuting high-ranking mobsters nearly impossible. For every murder, theft, or extortion scheme, the police were left with shadows but no faces, whispers but no witnesses. But this began to change with one ambitious man, Thomas E. Dewey, a young prosecutor whose political career was built on the promise of crushing organized crime. Dewey saw Luciano not just as a criminal kingpin but as the symbolic heart of America's criminal rot. Bringing down Luciano, Dewey knew, would elevate him to national fame. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was political warfare. He assembled a specialized team, conducted surveillance with unprecedented intensity, and leveraged the press to build public outrage. Newspapers painted Luciano as the mastermind behind every vice in New York. Whether accurate or not didn't matter, the public believed it and the pressure mounted. Luciano sensed the shift. Informants whispered that detectives were tailing his men. Union contacts hinted that government funds were being redirected to criminal investigations. Even the city's corrupt officials, long dependent on Mafia bribes, began distancing themselves, fearing Dewey's reach. Luciano had built a network strong enough to survive internal disputes, but the external threat was different. Law enforcement was learning to adapt. They were modernizing just as he had modernized crime. And in this hidden war, intelligence was as important as firepower. In response, Luciano tightened internal operations. Meetings became less frequent, communication more encrypted. Sensitive discussions took place only in secure locations: hotel rooms swept for bugs, restaurants with trusted staff, or secluded offices watched by armed guards. He warned his men about surveillance, reminding them that one careless conversation could unravel everything. But even as he strengthened defenses, he knew that every system had vulnerabilities. And one of those vulnerabilities was human greed. Dewey understood this too. If he couldn't break omerta directly, he could target those on the periphery: the madams, prostitutes, doormen, small-time gamblers, and whores who were not part of the Mafia's inner circle but lived within its influence. These individuals were not bound by Sicilian honor codes. They feared jail more than Mafia retribution. Dewey launched aggressive raids on brothels, arresting dozens in a single night. He interrogated operators until one finally broke, then another, then dozens more. They provided details, addresses, and even names. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to build a narrative. Luciano was the overlord of prostitution, the puppet master behind a sprawling sex empire. In the underworld, this was a dangerous accusation, not because it wasn't profitable but because drug trafficking, gambling, and extortion were seen as honorable criminal work. Prostitution, however, carried stigma among old-world mafiosi. It was considered dirty business, something beneath the dignity of Sicilian traditions. Luciano understood this cultural bias, which was why he stayed distant from the day-to-day operations. But Dewey's case didn't rely on cultural nuance. It relied on perception, and perception was powerful. While Dewey's crusade intensified, another danger grew in the shadows: internal conspiracies. Men who had once been loyal began contemplating their futures. Some, like Vito Genovese, saw Luciano's growing spotlight as a threat to the entire organization. If Luciano fell, the commission could collapse. Criminal empires thrived on secrecy, and Dewey's relentless pursuit was shining too bright a light. Genovese quietly distanced himself, spreading rumors that Luciano was becoming reckless. He hinted to allies that new leadership might be necessary, leadership less exposed, less targeted. Luciano sensed the betrayal, though Genovese never spoke openly. A glance, a tense handshake, an evasive answer. These were enough for Luciano to understand that even his own circle was beginning to fracture. The hidden war wasn't just between him and Dewey. It was also between him and those waiting to see whether he would survive the coming storm. As investigations tightened, Luciano's movements became restricted. He traveled discreetly, avoided unnecessary gatherings, and delegated responsibilities to Costello and Lansky. But Dewey's strategy wasn't focused on capturing Luciano physically, it was focused on trapping him legally. The prosecutor's team collected evidence like hunters circling prey, financial records, coded notes, intercepted messages, and the testimonies of compromised sex workers. Individually, the pieces were weak. Together, they formed a narrative strong enough for indictment. Meanwhile, the public's appetite for justice grew. Newspapers sensationalized every arrest. Politicians demanded action. Religious leaders condemned the moral decay of the city. Luciano had kept his empire shadowed for years, but headlines dragged him into the open. Each article strengthened Dewey's crusade. Each editorial tightened the noose. Inside the commission, panic began to stir. Some feared that Luciano's fame would bring collective destruction. Others believed that Dewey was bluffing, that no prosecutor could truly dismantle their empire. But Luciano, more perceptive than most, recognized the truth. The hidden war was no longer hidden. It was erupting, and its battlefield had shifted from the streets to the courts, from bullets to testimonies, from silence to headlines. He had always known that his greatest threat would not come from a rival mobster but from a system that could not be bribed, intimidated, or negotiated with. Dewey represented that system, a new kind of enemy, one shaped by ambition and righteousness rather than greed. Despite Luciano's attempts to shore up defenses, the war had reached its tipping point. The investigations were closing in. Informants were cooperating. Allies were wavering. The government was preparing its strike. And Luciano, once in complete control, now found himself fighting a battle he could not fully see or fully predict. The hidden war was ending. The public war was about to begin. The moment that would shatter Lucky Luciano's empire did not arrive with gunfire or a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, methodically, the inevitable result of months of pressure, investigation, and political ambition. By early 1936, the walls around him had tightened to the point where even his sharp instincts could no longer predict every threat. He had outmaneuvered mob wars, dethroned tyrants, built the commission, and created an empire more organized than any criminal network before him. But now, the danger came from a world he could not control: the courts, the headlines, and frightened witnesses willing to trade loyalty for freedom. The first blow came with a series of coordinated raids that shocked the entire underworld. Dozens of brothels linked, directly or indirectly, to Luciano's organization were stormed by police. Over 60 madams and sex workers were arrested in a single night. Within days, more were rounded up as Dewey's investigators swept through Manhattan's vice districts. The arrests were not the end goal, they were bait. Dewey expected someone to break under pressure, and he was right. The code of silence that protected mobsters did not bind those who lived at the edges of Luciano's empire. Many had no allegiance to him, no loyalty beyond fear, and fear of prison was stronger than fear of the Mafia. One by one they began naming names. They described the structure of the prostitution network, the flow of money, the protection rackets, the bribes, and, most importantly, the man at the top, at least as prosecutors wanted the story told. Luciano's name appeared again and again in their testimonies. Whether he had personally supervised the operations was irrelevant. Dewey crafted a narrative that portrayed Luciano as the mastermind behind a massive prostitution ring, the controller of hundreds of women, the exploiter of the city's underbelly. Public opinion turned swiftly. Headlines branded him the Vice King, a villain preying on vulnerable women. It didn't matter that the charges oversimplified the reality, what mattered was that the public believed them. Luciano understood immediately that he was in danger. He tried to maintain composure, meeting with Lansky, Costello, and his other trusted allies. They advised him to lay low, avoid public places, and let the political storm pass. But something deeper was brewing. Informants whispered that Dewey already had enough evidence for an indictment. Union contacts reported increased surveillance. Even friendly politicians avoided returning his calls. Luciano's empire depended on invisibility, but now his name was printed in every newspaper, his face splashed on every front page. He had become the most famous criminal in New York, exactly what a man in his position could never afford to be. The betrayals began quietly. Minor operatives started disappearing. Some fled the city, others surrendered themselves to authorities hoping for leniency. A few simply vanished, their loyalty evaporating the moment danger approached. But the most painful betrayal came from one man whose testimony would destroy everything: Cokie Flo Brown. A drug-addicted, unstable madam with a talent for manipulating those around her, Brown became Dewey's star witness. She claimed Luciano personally supervised her brothels, collected payments and issued threats. Much of her testimony was embellished or fabricated, but in court, her words carried weight. To Dewey she was the perfect narrative weapon. To Luciano she was the spark that lit the fuse. When Dewey issued the warrant for Luciano's arrest, it was not a surprise, but the timing caught him off guard. Luciano was staying at the Waldorf Astoria under an alias when detectives arrived to take him into custody. He didn't resist. He didn't panic. Instead, he walked calmly, coat draped over his arm, head held high as if he were the one escorting them. That was his signature: composure in crisis, confidence in conflict. Even as he slid into the police car, he projected an image of control. But beneath the surface, chaos erupted. The commission scrambled to understand the scope of Dewey's evidence. Was this a temporary setback? A political stunt? Or a real threat that could dismantle everything they had built? Costello feared a ripple effect through their operations. Lansky stressed the need for a legal strategy. Genovese, always watching for opportunities, remained suspiciously quiet. Luciano sensed something shifting, not just in the courtroom but in the shadows. His enemies, both known and hidden, were beginning to circle. As jail doors closed behind him, Luciano entered a new battlefield, one without guns, allies, or streets he knew like the back of his hand. Here, power belonged to prosecutors, judges, and witnesses whose loyalty could not be bought. The rules were different. The enemies were different. And the consequences were permanent. In the days following his arrest, more betrayals surfaced. Some associates attempted to distance themselves from him publicly, claiming they had minimal involvement in his operations. A few opportunistic rivals fed information to prosecutors, hoping to gain favor or eliminate competition indirectly. Even within his closest circle, quiet doubts spread. Could Luciano survive this? Could he return to power? Or had his reign reached its inevitable decline? Despite the tension, Luciano tried to maintain control. He ordered lawyers, arranged defense strategies, and instructed Costello and Lansky to keep operations stable. But no amount of planning could prevent what was coming. The government wasn't after a gangster, they were after a symbol. Luciano's downfall would validate years of political promises. Dewey wouldn't stop until he delivered the trophy. While Luciano sat behind bars awaiting trial, the underworld buzzed with uncertainty. Some considered stepping into the vacuum his absence created. Others feared making moves too soon, knowing that even in jail Luciano's influence lingered. But one man in particular saw opportunity where others saw danger: Vito Genovese. Ambitious, cunning, and patient, Genovese quietly maneuvered behind the scenes, positioning himself for the future. Luciano had always known Genovese was dangerous, but now, from inside a cell, he could do little to stop him. The fall of Lucky Luciano wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling engineered by a determined prosecutor, fueled by public pressure, and accelerated by betrayals both small and devastating. What began as scattered raids on brothels had transformed into a coordinated attack on the most powerful mob boss in America. And for the first time in his life, Luciano faced an enemy he couldn't negotiate with, intimidate, or eliminate. The courtroom would soon become the final battleground, and the outcome would either expose the cracks in his empire or reveal the extent of his resilience. But one truth was already clear: the fall had begun, and no amount of strategy could stop the momentum of what was coming next. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding. It was a public spectacle, a political theater designed to showcase the government's crusade against organized crime. From the moment Luciano stepped into the packed Manhattan courtroom, it was clear the battle ahead would be unlike anything he had faced before. His enemies no longer carried guns or wore rival colors. They wore suits, carried briefcases, and wielded public opinion like a weapon. In this arena, intimidation meant nothing. Strategy would have to take a different form, yet even strategy was limited. For perhaps the first time in his life, Luciano entered a battlefield he didn't fully understand. The prosecution, led by Thomas E. Dewey, approached the case with meticulous preparation. Every witness, every document, every accusation had been arranged to paint Luciano as the mastermind of a sprawling prostitution empire. Dewey didn't just want to prove guilt, he wanted to craft a narrative. And in narrative warfare he was a master. Newspapers reinforced the image daily, publishing exaggerated stories about Luciano's wealth, influence, and alleged cruelty. The public saw him not as a nuanced figure but as the embodiment of corruption. Luciano's defense team, while skilled, faced an uphill battle. Their primary challenge was combating the emotional weight of Dewey's case, which relied heavily on the testimonies of prostitutes and madams who claimed Luciano controlled their operations. Many were unreliable witnesses, drug addicts, petty criminals, and desperate women seeking reduced sentences, but their stories were sensational enough to sway jurors. Dewey presented them as victims of a merciless kingpin, women whose suffering could only be avenged through Luciano's conviction. In court, Cokie Flo Brown became the star witness. Her testimony was dramatic, tearful, and embellished in ways that fed directly into Dewey's narrative. She claimed Luciano had threatened her life, ordered beatings, and demanded payments. Much of it contradicted earlier statements she made, but Dewey shielded her inconsistencies with legal finesse. To the jury, her emotional performance was compelling. To Luciano, it was infuriating, but he remained composed, understanding that any display of anger could validate Dewey's portrayal of him. The prosecution also brought forward telephone operators, cab drivers, hotel clerks, and former associates, each adding small fragments to the mosaic of Dewey's argument. While none could definitively prove Luciano oversaw a prostitution ring, they created an atmosphere of guilt. Dewey didn't need ironclad evidence. He needed a believable story, reinforced by enough circumstantial threads to tighten the rope around Luciano's neck. Luciano's lawyers attempted to dismantle the prosecution's case by highlighting inconsistencies and questioning the credibility of witnesses. They argued, correctly, that none of the witnesses had direct contact with Luciano. They emphasized that Dewey's narrative relied on hearsay, assumptions, and exaggeration. But Dewey countered with confidence, claiming that a man of Luciano's stature would never personally handle transactional details. His absence from the crime scenes was presented as proof of leadership, not innocence. The courtroom atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled every seat, sketch artists captured Luciano's every expression, and spectators lined outside hoping to glimpse the infamous mob boss. The trial became a media frenzy, dominating headlines for weeks. Every dramatic moment, every raised voice, every tearful witness statement was magnified by newspaper editors hungry for sensational stories. Luciano understood the significance of perception. He wore tailored suits, spoke respectfully, and maintained a calm expression. His posture radiated confidence, and even when the testimony grew outrageous, he remained still, never interrupting, never scowling. He knew the cameras were watching. He knew the public was judging. But he also knew the trial's outcome was slipping out of his control. Behind the scenes, the commission monitored the trial with increasing anxiety. Costello and Lansky strategized about maintaining operations if Luciano fell. Genovese, eager for influence, positioned himself quietly, offering no support to Luciano's defense. Some believed the trial was political theater and that the charges would eventually collapse. Others feared Dewey's determination could not be underestimated. As the trial entered its final phase, Luciano's fate became a question of momentum rather than guilt. Dewey had built a compelling narrative. Public anger was high. The jury, composed of ordinary citizens influenced by daily headlines, faced enormous pressure. They were not just evaluating evidence, they were responding to a cultural moment, a city demanding justice, a nation hungry for a victory against organized crime. When the verdict finally arrived, the courtroom fell silent. The jury declared Lucky Luciano guilty on multiple counts of compulsory prostitution. The room erupted with mixed reactions, gasps, applause, murmurs. Reporters rushed out to deliver the news. Dewey stood tall, his face calm but triumphant. Luciano, as always, remained composed. He nodded slightly as if accepting the inevitable, though deep inside he understood the trial had been less about truth and more about symbolism. The sentence was devastating, 30 to 50 years in state prison. It was the harshest punishment ever handed to a major mob figure in American history. Dewey had made his mark. The public celebrated. Politicians applauded. The government declared it a historic victory. And for the first time since his rise to power, Luciano found himself truly removed from the empire he built. As he was led away in handcuffs, he walked with the same confident stride he always had. But beneath that calm surface ran a current of betrayal, bitterness, and reflection. He had survived gunmen, gang wars, and assassination attempts. But he could not survive a courtroom fueled by ambition and public outrage. The trial and sentence marked not just the end of Luciano's reign in New York, it signaled a shift in the balance of power within the Mafia and a transformation of the relationship between organized crime and the American justice system. The greatest criminal strategist of his era had met an opponent he could not outthink. But even from behind bars, Luciano's story was far from over. His influence lingered in the shadows, and the next chapter of his life would reveal that power does not disappear simply because a judge slams a gavel. In prison, Lucky Luciano would discover a new way to survive, and a new way to rule. When Lucky Luciano entered Dannemora State Prison, cold, isolated, and infamous for housing the most hardened offenders, many believed his reign was over. To the public, this was justice. To prosecutors, it was victory. To rival gangsters, it was a long-awaited shift in power. But those who truly understood Luciano knew something different. A prison cell was not the end of his influence. If anything, it was simply a new environment for him to adapt to. And adaptation was a skill he had mastered long before stepping behind bars. From the moment the steel door clanged shut behind him, Luciano understood he had to control perception. He refused to let the guards see weakness. He refused to let other inmates sense fear. The underworld watched closely, waiting to see if the once powerful boss would crumble under confinement. But Luciano remained composed, carrying himself with the same quiet authority he had shown in court. He walked through the prison yard as if he were entering a meeting room, not a cage. He greeted guards with calm nods, spoke respectfully to inmates, and observed everything, every routine, every clique, every opportunity. At first, the adjustment was harsh. The isolation, the regimented schedule, the low status assigned to incoming inmates, all of it tested his resolve. But prison also offered something unexpected: time. Time to think. Time to analyze the mistakes that led to his downfall. Time to reimagine the future. While others saw punishment, Luciano saw pause, a forced step back from the rapidly shifting currents of the underworld. And within that pause he found space to rebuild. Power behind bars came from three sources: respect, connections, and stability. Luciano possessed all three. Word of his arrival spread quickly through inmate gossip networks. Men who had only heard his name in whispers now saw him walking the yard. Even those who knew nothing of the commission or his empire sensed he was someone of weight. His quiet confidence, his composed posture, his ability to solve disputes with a single sentence, all of it elevated him above the average convict. Soon, inmates began approaching him for advice, mediation, or protection. Without ever raising his voice, he gained influence. He also formed valuable alliances with guards. Not through bribery, at least not initially, but through patience and respect. Luciano understood human behavior better than most psychologists. He knew guards were often overworked, underpaid, and disillusioned. He treated them like people, not obstacles. Over time, trust developed naturally. A guard would linger a little longer by his cell door. Another would allow him extended recreation time. Eventually, a network of sympathetic officers emerged, men willing to turn a blind eye in exchange for quiet assistance, favors, or simply the lack of trouble Luciano ensured in his presence. But perhaps the most important aspect of Luciano's prison life was his continued connection to the outside world. Even imprisoned, he remained a central figure in the Mafia's operations. Visitors from his organization, Some legitimate, others disguised as lawyers or intermediaries, came regularly carrying messages, updates, and decisions. Through these carefully orchestrated channels, Luciano maintained a degree of control over the empire he had built. Frank Costello, now a powerful figure in New York's political rackets, served as Luciano's voice on the outside. Meyer Lansky kept financial operations stable and expanding. Even Bugsy Siegel sent updates from the West Coast, where Las Vegas was beginning its transformation into a gambler's paradise. Luciano listened carefully to every word, offering guidance from within the concrete walls of his cell. He could no longer dictate every move, but his influence shaped decisions large and small. He remained a shadow behind the commission, a silent figure whose advice was sought and whose approval carried weight. Despite this, prison life forced Luciano into an unfamiliar emotional space. With no streets to walk, no deals to negotiate, no empires to physically oversee, he confronted the solitude he had long avoided. Nights were the hardest. Alone in his cell, he replayed the events that led to his downfall. The betrayals, the witnesses, the trial, the sentence. He reflected on his choices, those he was proud of and those he regretted. For a man who had always controlled the narrative of his life, being confined left him to face the story he couldn't rewrite. Yet even this internal reckoning became a form of strength. The prison forced him to sharpen parts of himself that had been overshadowed by his rapid rise to power. He learned patience in a way he never had before. He learned detachment, understanding which battles mattered and which did not. He learned resilience that did not depend on physical freedom. In many ways, the prison forged a more reflective, more calculated version of the man he had been outside. But not every change came from introspection. Prison politics remained dangerous. Conflicts brewed among inmates, and Luciano occasionally found himself drawn into situations he preferred to avoid. Some tested him, hoping to earn reputation by challenging the most famous man inside. Others sought his favor. Luciano handled each situation with precision, never provoking violence unless absolutely necessary, never refusing a request outright, never compromising his dignity or safety. His ability to navigate the prison's unwritten rules mirrored how he once navigated the streets. Years passed and the world outside shifted. Prohibition ended. Political alliances changed. Rivalries evolved. A new generation of gangsters rose. Yet Luciano remained connected enough to understand these shifts and adapt accordingly. Surprisingly, his imprisonment also softened his image among some law enforcement officials. He became less of a dangerous criminal in their eyes and more of a relic, an aging man trapped by time and walls. But fate had one more twist in store. When World War II erupted, rumors began circulating about the Mafia's potential cooperation with the U.S. government to protect ports and gather intelligence about enemy activity. These rumors would open a door that no one expected, a door that would lead Luciano out of the shadows of prison and back into the world's spotlight. For now, though, he remained behind bars, holding on to something few inmates possessed: influence. Power behind bars looked different than power on the streets. It was quieter, subtler, and more fragile. But it was power nonetheless, and Luciano wielded it with the same intelligence and restraint that had once made him the most formidable mob boss in America. Lucky Luciano's release from prison in 1946 came under extraordinary circumstances. Circumstances that would shape both the final phase of his life and the underworld he once commanded. While the public believed his freedom was a reward for assisting the U.S. government during World War II, the truth was far more nuanced. Luciano had indeed provided aid, facilitating connections with dock workers, Mafia-controlled unions, and Sicilian contacts who helped Allied forces gather intelligence and secure coastal operations. But the government's decision to commute his sentence was driven equally by political calculation and quiet fear that keeping him in prison could provoke turmoil within the underworld. His freedom, however, came with a price: permanent deportation. The man who once ruled New York's criminal empire was escorted onto a ship and exiled to Italy, a country he had left as a child and no longer recognized as home. As the coastline of the United States faded into the horizon, Luciano stood silently on deck, understanding that the world he built, the streets, the clubs, the commission, was now beyond his reach. Yet exile did not extinguish his ambition. If anything, it ignited a final surge of strategy. Luciano was convinced that he could still shape the future of organized crime, even from afar. When he arrived in Naples, he tried to blend into the old-world rhythms he had long forgotten. The narrow streets, aged stone buildings, and slow-moving routines contrasted sharply with the bustling streets of New York. But even in unfamiliar surroundings, Luciano remained a man of purpose. Within weeks, the underworld sought him out. Small-time smugglers, black market dealers, and Sicilian intermediaries visited him, seeking advice or approval. Despite deportation, Luciano retained an aura, a presence that commanded respect as soon as he entered a room. To them, he was not an exile, he was a king forced into a different kind of palace. Meanwhile, his former associates in the United States struggled to determine how much influence he truly held. Frank Costello maintained a steady grip on political operations. Lansky expanded into Cuba, building luxurious casinos in Havana and forging connections with international financiers. Vito Genovese, Luciano's most cunning rival, maneuvered aggressively, seeing Luciano's absence as a chance to shape the American Mafia in his own image. Genovese sent messages suggesting cooperation, but Luciano understood the hidden intent. Genovese was positioning himself to take over completely. Despite distance and danger, Luciano began working on his endgame, re-establishing a central role in international narcotics trafficking. During the post-war recovery period, the black market exploded across Europe. The demand for morphine derivatives, heroin, and opiates surged. Luciano recognized that Italy and Sicily could become major distribution hubs. Through discreet meetings in Naples, Palermo, and Rome, he helped organize a network that connected Middle Eastern suppliers with American distributors. Whether he directly managed the routes or simply approved them is still debated, but what's certain is that he played an influential role in shaping the system that would later be known as the French Connection. But Luciano's ambitions extended beyond narcotics. The emotional pull of New York never disappeared. He longed to see the city again, to walk its streets, reconnect with old friends, and reclaim a piece of the life stolen from him. And in 1946, he got his chance during the infamous Havana Conference. The Commission's leaders and major crime figures gathered in Cuba to discuss the future of organized crime. Luciano, though banned from the United States, arrived in Havana as a respected statesman of the underworld. The conference marked his brief return to power. He delivered speeches, mediated disputes, and sought to balance the growing tensions among American families. But his presence in Cuba triggered alarm within the U.S. government. They feared that Luciano was rebuilding his empire and potentially influencing narcotics distribution. Under diplomatic pressure, the Cuban authorities detained him and forced him back to Italy. His second exile sealed his fate. Luciano would never again set foot in the United States. Back in Naples, Luciano's life took on a strange duality. On one hand, he lived in relative isolation, monitored constantly by police, shadowed by informants, and restricted in his movements. On the other hand, he continued to serve as a consigliere of sorts, a retired emperor whose advice still shaped criminal decisions across oceans. He spent hours in cafes, speaking quietly with visitors who traveled from New York, Sicily, France, or South America. Some came for guidance. Others came to pledge loyalty. A few came to test his relevance, only to leave convinced that even in exile Luciano's mind remained sharper than theirs. As he aged, Luciano became more reflective. He often spoke about how crime had changed, how the new generation lacked discipline, how greed overshadowed strategy, how violence had become reckless rather than calculated. He expressed pride in what he had built but frustration at what it was becoming. He recognized that the world no longer needed a figure like him. It had evolved into something more chaotic, more decentralized, less bound by the laws he had once imposed. Yet he did not view his exile solely as loss. In quieter moments, he found a form of peace he never experienced in New York. He visited old neighborhoods, reconnected with distant relatives, and developed an unexpected appreciation for the simplicity of everyday life. But even peace was incomplete. Deep inside, he still felt the pull of unfinished business, the weight of legacy, the desire to ensure that the system he built did not collapse into senseless violence. Luciano's final years were spent living between two identities, the aging man walking Neapolitan streets and the mastermind who still influenced global crime. His endgame was not domination, it was preservation. He had shaped organized crime into a structured machine, and even from exile he wanted to guide its evolution. But the world around him was shifting, and his ability to control it was diminishing. The exile did not break Luciano. It transformed him, offering him both clarity and sorrow. And as his life moved toward its final chapter, one final gambit remained, a move that would define how history remembered him. In the final stretch of Lucky Luciano's life, when exile had stripped him of territory, influence, and the daily pulse of New York's underworld, he made one last move, quiet, strategic, and far more transformative than any assassination, alliance, or commission meeting he had ever orchestrated. It wasn't about reclaiming power. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about returning to the throne he once occupied. Instead, Luciano's last gambit was about shaping the future of organized crime long after he was gone, an invisible legacy move, executed in whispers and shadows, that would rewrite the global underworld forever. By the early 1950s, Luciano understood something that many mobsters refused to accept. The American Mafia was entering a new era, one increasingly defined by fragmentation, arrogance, and a reckless hunger for fast money. The disciplined structure he had built, carefully balanced, meticulously organized, was starting to crack. The commission still existed, but unity was weakening. Younger bosses craved notoriety instead of longevity. Heroin networks were expanding beyond control. Violence was becoming impulsive rather than calculated. Luciano feared that the house he built was rotting from within. So, in exile, he began crafting his final move, one that would influence the underworld's future direction without requiring him to physically return to New York. Luciano realized that his power no longer came from commanding soldiers or running rackets. It came from being the only figure with enough historical weight, strategic insight, and global perspective to restore balance through diplomacy. His last gambit began in conversations, quiet meetings in Naples cafes, discreet gatherings in hotel rooms, or long talks behind closed doors with emissaries sent from America, Sicily, France, and Cuba. He didn't order. He advised. He didn't threaten. He warned. He didn't impose. He persuaded. And slowly he became a mentor to the next generation of mob leaders. Men who had never known the brutality of the Castellamarese War, who had never seen the streets before he reorganized them, who had inherited wealth and power without understanding the cost of maintaining it. Luciano stressed three things. Structure must always outweigh ego, violence must be controlled, and international cooperation was the future of crime, not localized feuds. He knew the Mafia was no longer an American problem. It had become a global ecosystem. Narcotics routes connected continents. Money laundering required international sophistication. The underworld was becoming multinational, and he wanted to ensure that the emerging generation understood the importance of alliances over chaos. But Luciano's last gambit wasn't just philosophical, it was operational. Behind the scenes, he helped formalize a new transnational heroin network that tied together Turkish suppliers, Sicilian refiners, French traffickers, and American distributors. Whether he directly managed the pipeline remains debated, but historians agree on one thing. Luciano's connections and strategic mind played a foundational role. He didn't need to run the system, he needed to shape its architecture. And he did. This network would later feed the French Connection, which dominated global heroin trade for decades. His fingerprints were all over the blueprint, even if his name was never officially tied to it. But the other half of Luciano's final move was more subtle, protecting the structure of the Mafia itself from internal implosion. He rejected attempts by men like Vito Genovese to create a dictatorship within the American mob. Luciano understood that a boss of bosses system led to war, paranoia, and collapse. In his final years, he used whatever influence he still held to reinforce the commission model, pushing for shared leadership, balanced territories, and strategic cooperation. His exile status gave him something rare: neutrality. He was above the jealousy and ambition that consumed others. He had nothing to gain and nothing to prove. That made his voice powerful. In this way, Luciano became the Mafia's elder statesman, a stabilizing force guiding an underworld that could easily have splintered into irreparable chaos. His endgame wasn't about personal authority, it was about preserving the system he built, ensuring that young mobsters inherited an organized world rather than the violent swirl of chaos he had once inherited himself. His final gambit reached its emotional climax on January 26, 1962. Luciano arrived at the Naples airport to meet with an American film producer preparing a biographical movie about his life, a project Luciano believed would cement the narrative he wanted history to remember. Moments after greeting the producer, Luciano collapsed onto the pavement. A heart attack ended his life before he could speak another word. Just like that, the man who had survived knives, bullets, betrayals, and prison fell silently in a public place, far from the city that made him a king. Yet even in death, his influence reverberated. Police who searched his belongings found notes, correspondence, and coded lists that hinted at his final years of networking. Mobsters across 3 continents acknowledged that his advice had shaped their decisions. Newspapers declared his death the end of an era. But those who understood the underworld knew the truth. Luciano's last gambit had succeeded. The structure he created, the international networks he helped design, and the philosophical framework he reinforced continued shaping organized crime long after his body was laid to rest. In the end, Luciano didn't rewrite Mafia history with violence or titles. He rewrote it through legacy, through a final, strategic imprint that outlived him and defined the criminal world for generations.